You're listening to the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT podcast. I'm your host and curator, Rabbi Kivelevitz, and I hope you enjoy this episode. You've bought your tickets. The ushers are about to open the doors. Yes, the Projectionist has Semicha is about to start. But first, if you own a retail business and accept credit cards, your customers are getting points, miles, and all sorts of rewards every time they use their card. And you're paying the price. That's why NRS Pay, a product of National Retail Solutions, a division of the IDT Corporation, offers its cash discount program FeeBuster. You can start accepting credit cards for free. If your business processes over $18,000 a month, you pay no monthly fee and $0 out of your pocket for transaction. This means you, as a retailer, can enjoy the benefits of accepting plastic, and your customers still get those crucial miles they crave and need. NRS Pay FeeBuster provides every client with a free credit card reader with no long-term contract, no early termination fee, cancel anytime without a penalty. I'm personally familiar with this company, and they truly stand by their product, and they'll help you with live, stateside-based customer service on any issue or question. Visit nrspay.com or call 833-289-2767 to learn more about NRS Pay and the fantastically fair FeeBuster. Clear the aisles. The Projectionist has Semicha. Hi, I'm here with Rabbi Kolakowski, who is still glowing, even though I don't even see him. But I feel the glow, the warmth, the incredible good spirits that surround him as he has spent that last weekend in Mars, Pennsylvania, really reveling in Monster Bash and all the good feelings that you talked about last week about that. I know that there were a lot of highlights, but to me, the main highlight for me when hearing about what you did in Monster Bash was the fact that you went to see a film that starred a very famous actor who was in many, many monster films. The person who developed the Wolfman character, Lon Chaney Jr., and you saw him in a role that you wouldn't have expected. This was the unexpected Yitzchak Kolakowski experience. Was you watched Of Mice and Men?
Right. I was planning when I saw that it was being shown. I said, well, I better watch that because this way I'll have something to talk about that's a little bit more highbrow. I'll get into your territory, out of the B movies and into the real A movies.
This was a film that was nominated for Best Picture,
and it was nominated among some really great films.
Everyone knows 1939 is movie aficionados refer to it as the ultimate year of film, the best year of all time of films.
Yeah, well, I mean, Gone with the Wind won Best Picture that year, but Wizard of Oz was nominated. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington was nominated among. I think there were 8 Best Picture nominations that year, and Of Mice and Men was one of them. I think back then they had more nominations every year for the Best Picture.
Right,
but sort of Mice and Men, it was a contender among several great films.
So let's just give a little background before we talk about the film itself. It was based, of course, on a novella written by John Steinbeck.
Just 2 years before the film came out.
Right. And when Steinbeck wrote this novella, which is a little bit over 100 pages, he wrote it really with the intent to make it into a play. It's almost like if you read the novella, you could almost see the stage direction and a play developing. And this little novella was a pretty successful, or at least critically successful, Broadway stage play, and then moved to Los Angeles. And it was there that Chaney assumed the role of Lenny, Leonard Smalls, the developmentally disabled fellow who is making his way together with his friend George. Steinbeck was writing at the same time the great American novel, The Grapes of Wrath, which of course was turned into a film the next year. But Steinbeck was really obsessed with what was occurring in the United States. The Great Depression had altered the trajectory of success for so many. And the meltdown after the stock market crash and the Great Depression had sent really shockwaves of change throughout the country. And although in the beginning of the century, there was almost this tremendous optimism, but when the economic despair started to spread through the areas, especially what was in the South, in the areas that were known as the Dust Bowl, so there was this migration of people moving towards something. Steinbeck was enchanted almost in a tragic way of everyone's dreams trying to be fulfilled. People who had lost everything were hoping that somehow there was a sliver of hope by moving towards the Pacific, towards the West, towards what was becoming the dream factories in California, the places where there was still verdant hills and growth and production and fruit and vegetation. And, the Grapes of Wrath, of course, is the Odyssey, that family and the tragedy. And I think of Mice and Men is sort of like a little sliver of that same story.
It makes me think, I wonder, what great stories will come out of this age. I don't think we have anyone like that composing these types of stories, telling the stories of the pandemic and all these things. They're not captured in the same way.
You're right, because I think one of the problems, Yitzchak, is that although Steinbeck was definitely a believer in social change, you think about the Grapes of Wrath. After Steinbeck wrote that novel, the United States government in the Roosevelt administration changed many laws and regulations dealing with how migrant workers needed to be treated. The descriptions and again, Steinbeck himself wasn't always a successful writer. He worked in those fields. He lived among the people. When he went to gather information for his books, he lived that life. Even, the character that I mentioned, Lon Chaney's character, Lenny, who we're going to talk about, Steinbeck based him on a real person, a real development disabled person that Steinbeck knew. So, yes, the Steinbeck's novels were meant to grab you. They were meant to shape you and change you, and they did change society. And he was, in many ways, one of the most important writers of the late 1930s and 1940s. I think Hollywood recognized this afterwards, and I think he did a little bit of screenwriting in Hollywood in the 40s, and he never really, recaptured that level of prominence. He wrote a number of very important books in the 1950s. I think we've talked about one of the film adaptations of that book, of course, which is East of Eden. And I mentioned, which of course is one of I think it was James Dean's the first film that James Dean was in. But the type of incredible influence of an author, you're correct. I have to tell you, before we talk about the film, when you told me this morning that how this was the film you saw, I mentioned to you how Steinbeck has been a searing presence in my life since I was about 11 years old, maybe even earlier. And by the time I went to yeshiva at the age of 13, I had already read much of what Steinbeck had written, and I continued, throughout my high school days to really enjoy reading Steinbeck. And he and Sinclair Lewis, who was one of the other premier American novelists of the day, were seminal influences on my artistic and I think my whole outlook towards the outside world. The cynicism of Sinclair Lewis, and I would say the romantic lyricism of Steinbeck. But I think one of the things you see from of Mice and Men and The Grapes of Wrath and Cannery Row and the other books of that era is that Steinbeck recognized that human beings are in a struggle to survive, and a struggle to be understood, a struggle to be known, a struggle for comfort, the lies that we tell ourselves, the smallness that encumbers us. Steinbeck is not a fun read. It's not like a Tom Clancy super tech novel or an Ian Fleming book like we spoke about with Tom Shabilla. Steinbeck is somewhat morose. It's lachrymose, I would say. And the stories are tragic. I mean, I wasn't surprised, Yitzchak, that you said to me that earlier off pod that as you continued to watch this film, there were tears in your eyes by the time the film had ended.
It's never a surprise with me. I cry pretty easily. My kids will admit, but it was. But I probably wasn't crying as strongly as I do with some other films or music or things. But it stuck with me, and it really made me think about a lot of people who I know that I work with, people who are incarcerated, people who are in mental hospitals, and how they're struggling and they working with their dreams and their obsessions. And I know plenty of people like all of these characters in real life.
Yes, not just Lenny. So let's just set the tone a little bit. You have these two sort of, they seem to be on the run, Lenny and George.
They are on the run because George got in trouble.
And George, right? They're on the run because George has taken Lenny under his wing. Lenny is a huge person in the novel. I'm not sure if Lon Chaney himself was of such great stature.
He was, but they certainly made him look bigger in the movie. I mean, he's next to Burgess Meredith, who was not a big person.
Right. So it wasn't hard to indicate that he was the largest person around. But you're right. That's part of the camera techniques that Louis Milestone, the director, used to emphasize this point. And they are on the run because Lenny has a penchant for soft things. And he is a man, however, a man with a child's mind and a man's body. So although what he likes is to just pet soft things, he can't, as much as he enjoys little puppies and other soft rabbits to pet and feel how warm they are, he also feels an attraction towards women. And they are on the run because the authorities or the people at the last work camp suspect that Lenny is, or at least was, for attempted of a rape of a girl. So as they come to this new place, they are met by a whole number of characters that Steinbeck is able to develop in the book and in the play, and they're brought to life really wonderfully in the film. You have not only Slim and Candy, but you also have, I guess, the two most evil people in the film, which is Curly and May.
Yeah.
Curly is the son of the ranch's owner, clearly someone with something like a Napoleon complex, and it would seem a little bit more than that. I always got the impression when I read the book or the novella that the reason why his wife, who was very attractive and super flirtatious with all the ranch hands, is because she's not being satisfied by Curly. The Curly is either impotent or definitely is considered unattractive to her. And
I mean, obviously in the film, this is after the Hays Code. There really is no clear indication of that. I think if the movie and the book had been written, 7 years earlier, 9 years earlier, if it was something from 1931, 32, they probably would have been.
I think the play actually had a number of terms which would qualify as pure vulgarity. I'm pretty sure, and there was the censors worked very hard. Eugene Solo, one of our tribe, was the screenwriter who cleaned it up a little bit, but still tried to retain the idea. And I think even after the Hays Code,
the truth is, May doesn't even seem. I would again. I never read the book. I never saw the play. I'd assume in the book and the play she is more flirtatious. Here, it just seems that she's just bored. That there is more to life. It almost seems. I didn't even really feel it that it was that she wasn't satisfied in the bedroom as much as that she wasn't satisfied outside. That she kind of felt herself as just someone who was, a slave to this guy that she married, and she was looking for her independence. She was looking for friendship, for something. I really had from the movie. I felt the opposite. Not that he was impotent, but rather that he was just using her, and that was it. And that she was looking for more romance and not and not just to be an object.
Mm-hmm.
And not even romance, but also just social. That's how it's really presented, is that she was just looking to socialize and for someone to talk to, and there were no women around for her to socialize with. Meaning, if she wasn't there on a ranch with only men, she probably would have had a social life with the other women around, but there were no women around for her to socialize with.
As the only woman on the ranch, she would obviously generate feelings and the attractions of all the men.
Not really, because they were so afraid of her husband. They wanted nothing to do with her. Even if they felt an attraction to her, they expressed that attraction of, you're dangerous. We're not playing with fire.
But the reason it's fire is again, because if you do stick your hand to the honeypot, the trap of Curly, her husband, is going to snap on you. And right. He, of course, was someone who was a sadist in a certain way. He's someone who enjoyed hurting people.
He was looking for fights. He liked to pick fights.
Yes, and again, I think part of it is the Napoleon complex. He's obviously a smaller person, and I think it's a big.
He might have beat her as well. That's not really so indicated. She said very openly that she doesn't like him. That I don't know if she says at any point she hates him, but she says several times that she doesn't like him and she wants to leave.
Well, she's fascinated by the fact that somebody has crushed his hand, because when there is a altercation that occurs, it turns out that Lenny, because of his strength, is able to crush Curly's hand. And I think when she comes to investigate who did it, it's clear that we're talking here about a metaphor. And what becomes clear in the dialogue is that Lenny and George would like to be able to escape and to find a farm of their own, perhaps with Candy or one of the other characters. There is really, in many ways, a groundbreaking character in the film that is a character, of course, from the original book and play, and that is Lee Whipper, a African-American actor who was in the original Broadway version of the play, and he reprised his role in this film. And the film makes very clear that there is a racist negative attitude. In many ways, it's a very progressive statement. We realize that Crooks is more, in many ways, a very well-read, intelligent person, and yet he cannot even sleep with the other ranch hands. He has to sleep in the stable with the animals. And he is one of Lenny's confidants. And he, of course, becomes part of this dream as well, this dream that George and Lenny and Candy, they share, this idea that perhaps they'll eventually be able to have enough money that they'll be able to buy their own little ranch and raise the types of rabbits and other things that they dream of. And you sort of know, Yitzchak, that none of this could happen. This was America in the most difficult times of the Depression, and the type of cruelty that was exercised by people against each other, which is indicated by Curly. And even as you say, you might think that May is very sympathetic, but clearly she knows the power that she has. She realizes, I think, what she can do, and she's a selfish person. Now, Lenny almost can't help being who he is. In today's time, when we talk about developmentally disabled people, Lenny would have gotten much more support. Had Lenny been born, had the story happened 40 years later, even in the Dust Bowl, there would have been treatments, there would have been homes, there would have been places where health professionals could have treated Lenny in a way that he could interact safely. As the way the period was, Lenny had to fend on his own. And as much as George tries to protect him, George, I think when he starts feeling good about himself, I think he leaves Lenny. And that's when trouble occurs, because that's when May, looking for the person who has crushed Curly's hand, finds Lenny. And Lenny is attracted to her, and she asks him if Lenny wants to stroke her hair. And of course, her hair is soft, like like the fur of a puppy dog or of a rabbit. And this leads to Lenny, because of his great strength, to hold on to her too tightly. So after Lenny inadvertently kills May and George comes back and discovers what has happened, it's clear that there's now going to be a lynch mob centered on the murderer. Of course, Lenny didn't want to do anything like that, but there's no way this could be described. The attitude towards persons of limited mental faculty wasn't one that they would allow Lenny off the hook. So as you pointed out, Yitzchak, that earlier in the film, they talk about a dog having to be put down. And of course, the owner of the dog felt that he didn't want the doctor or someone else putting it down. He felt that if something had to die, it should be put down by someone who loved him. As was said earlier in the film, it's the person who loves the animal should be the one who put it down. So in that sense, as the film ends, spoilers here, George has to unfortunately do the deed. He doesn't want it to be done by Curly and his mob. And, it ends really, with this inevitable sense of fate, which is really what the title of the piece is, of Mice and Men, from Robert Burns's poem, that this is the fate of man, whether it's a mouse or a man. This is what occurs, the vicissitudes and tribulations that are heaped upon us, things that we can't control, and especially for Americans during this period, Americans of the underclass who weren't able to move forward, the crushing heel of fate. And, that's really, in a way, the way the film ends. Although, of course, there's just like The Grapes of Wrath, there's an appeal for change, perhaps a way that we should have more compassion and understanding for each other. Now, even before I was introduced to Steinbeck, and I think this is true for yourself as well, I knew this character of Lenny. Which way did they go, George? Which way did they go? Which way did they go? Right. And this, of course, was from the Warner cartoons, where they would have a very large, silly dog and a smaller dog that sort of was the short dog that would be pushing the big dog around. And of course, the big dog was the muscle who with very little brain. And I think they were both after, instead of the soft, tiny rabbit, they were after this wiseacre Brooklyn denizen type rabbit known as Bugs Bunny. And that is where that character, that dog who speaks like a Lenny, showed up.
And the trope appeared other times in the Looney Tunes cartoons. Sometimes, after Bugs Bunny would get hit on the head.
That's right. All of a sudden, he would start talking like Lenny. We realized that this is really a sort of a cruel way to sort of make fun of people who have diminished mental capacities, right?
Yeah.
And maybe that's part of the reason why, I'm not advocating censorship, but I think it's important to understand that it wasn't just a Curly and his group that were insensitive to someone of limited mental capacities. It was basically in society. Society, could use this as you say, something to laugh about, despite what Steinbeck wanted.
And an interesting thing that I caught there at Monster Bash, there was a lecture from an author, I believe his name Gregory Menk, who speaks every year at Monster Bash. And I only caught the end of his lecture this weekend, which he presented just before. And one of the things that he mentioned was that they had actually filmed a scene that was in the book, that just before George kills Lenny, Lenny has this, horrible, haunting vision of, I believe, his aunt coming as a ghost, telling him that he's worthless. And then a giant rabbit also berating him and belittling him. And so they filmed a scene, with trick photography of both the ghost and the giant rabbit, the person in the rabbit costume. And they felt that perhaps, that would ruin the serious nature of the film, that someone would see this and just start laughing at the giant rabbit, that especially if they might have the wrong audience presenting this film. And so it was a very wise move to remove that.
Right. It's put this way, sometimes being sparse is better than trying to investigate the inner workings of characters.
And it also makes more of a universality that, these characters represent archetypes that are bigger than themselves. When you get everything, when you hand everybody everything on a silver platter, it diminishes. It's, it's fasta mover like fasta type of a thing
which is part of the reason why characters in Shakespeare's plays, or even going back even to the theater of Greek tragedy, much more can be invested in every generation. And we should say, Of Mice and Men has been produced very often since the 1930s, most famously in the Steppenwolf theater production with Gary Sinise and John Malkovich, who took that and made it into a pretty highly acclaimed film in the 90s, starring those same two roles. Again, George Segal played George in a TV version in the late 60s. I should also mention Broderick Crawford originated the character on Broadway. And Broderick Crawford also, before he became the highway patrolman leader in that wonderful television series, the 1950s, he sort of also was made a career out of playing big, dumb characters, whether it was in Born Yesterday or in Larceny Incorporated. That sort of was Broderick Crawford's stock and trade. He played a much different character in All the King's Men, but again, the big lumbering fellow. But the point I'm trying to get to is this character of Lenny was in a way a great boon for Lon Chaney Jr.
That was one of the things that Greg Mank mentioned as well, that he was almost a washed-up actor at this point. He'd already appeared amazingly in 50 films by the time he made this, and this was really his big break.
I'm looking here, Yitzchak, at some of the posters that the film generated. And of course, you go to different eras, when it was re-released in various stages in the 1940s. And I think one of, eventually, here's some of the blurb from the poster. The picture Hollywood said could never be made. And again, Hal Roach, who was, of course, we've talked about him and his role in the comedies.
By that time, he was actually getting away from comedy. He actually made another movie which had Lon Chaney in it the same year, or the next year, was 1 Million BC. So he was getting away from the comedy world and trying different genres.
Well, as he says, a mighty novel, a sensational stage success. Now, the year's most important picture of Mice and Men. Interesting, Betty Field's performance was obviously a big hit with viewers, because in this poster, her face is in color, centered, and there's almost like a word balloon coming out of her mouth saying, "I'm decent, I tell you. Nobody's got the right to call me names." Well, look, I've without seeing the film for about 40 years or so, I think we've done a good job talking about it, and perhaps, as you say, we are recommending it for at least a view of what was a piece of Hollywood history, a piece of Americana history.
But also something timeless, because there are a lot of films that are historical in nature, to present something in its time period. And that was the big question that I had earlier, was who's going to tell the timeless story that takes place in this era? I don't know if and it doesn't even have to be a novel. It could be a film, could be a television show. Steinbeck was able to make a statement without effort. He presented particularly, that African-American character as the lonely intellectual, so he broke so many stereotypes with this character, but he presented a real human being, and all of these characters are so real that none of them are caricatures.
Let's talk about a little bit about Slim, played by Charles Bickford, one of my favorite character actors, who, I don't think he ever mailed in a performance. He has an intensity and sort of unlike other, you can't typecast him. He's somebody who can play evil. He could play sympathetic, sort of a little bit like Arthur Kennedy, but I think with a little even a greater intensity. It's Charles Bickford as Slim. Let's end tonight talking a little bit about Burgess Meredith, who, this was a film that was one of his first films. He was, in the making of this film, he was already 32 years old. He had already, I guess, done a number of theater at this point. He had a great range as a character actor.
Range. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, most people probably know him as Mickey, Rocky Balboa's corner man, the manager who stirred Rocky to become a fighter to take on Apollo Creed, or
he was a Jewish character.
Yes,
Mickey.
He played a Jewish character, although Burgess Meredith was very far from being a Jew. Or the Penguin.
But then there was the Twilight Zone appearances, especially
the two Twilight Zone appearances that he was in. Yes, Time Enough. So, but he's someone who I think is underappreciated, though. Really,
all of these characters are such a wide range. You would hardly know this was the same actor if you didn't know it was him playing all of these different characters.
And considering, his distinct aspect of himself, he was able really to inhabit many, many different parts. I have to say, when I think about Batman's Rogues Gallery, I sort of think that he's really the best of all of them.
Yeah.
Burgess Meredith, really, you could tell how much he loved doing it.
Yeah.
And we've talked about the various Catwomans and the different actors who played Mr. Freeze, including Otto Preminger. I think the most consistent was probably Burgess as the Penguin. There's something to say when you commit yourself to a role, even when it's kitsch.
It's back to Lon Chaney committing to the role of the Wolfman in 5
yes.
and keeping that storyline when all the other characters lost it at some point, but that character remained really the central. Once the Wolfman entered the Universal Cinematic Universe, it became central to really any film he was in more than the others. And Chaney also, though he played all the other monsters, he played the Frankenstein monster, he played the Mummy several times, and he was the son of Dracula, Count Alucard. So he really he covered the only one he never was the creature from the Black Lagoon.
I see. Right. He was before, that was sort of after his time.
Well, no, he was still making films, so he wasn't working for Universal at that time.
I think The Grapes of Wrath and Of Mice and Men are two films that are wonderfully true to Steinbeck's vision, considering the limitations of the Hays Code and just in terms of the economy of style and time. And I think both of them really are a testament to what Steinbeck wanted to do. And as you say, Yitzchak, we are in a period that is perhaps not as devastating as the period of the Depression, but it's definitely, we are going through shocks in our society and our communities. And I think films like these, although, as you say, you don't want necessarily, they aren't going to make you laugh. You're not at all going to walk out of these films touched by happiness, but I think they will make you understand the inequities in society, the difficulties we all have in relating, and the importance of trying to break through and understand the other person.
I think one thing is that where the story ends, you have this ambiguity of what's going to happen to George afterwards. Now, obviously, his dream is not going to come true, but what did he do? Was that a world that he lived in, which was a contemporary world where vigilante justice was the norm? Or was he someone who is now going to spend time in prison for murder? What did he do? Was he the owner, just put down a sick dog, or was he?
You're raising a good point. I think, as there was almost like a law within itself on these ranches and in these areas. I think that was part of what Steinbeck was trying to portray, that, these little microcosms of society that were existing there.
Well, he hands the gun over to the police officer, but he hands it over with a
resignation that perhaps he is now going to have to go.
But he covers it up, so and he was holding the gun with a cloth the whole time to try to avoid any fingerprints or anything, it would seem, and he hands it over with the cloth. Maybe it's indicating that the police officer shot him, and he's meaning he did the police officer's work, and he's going to get off scot-free and maybe even go back to work at the ranch, who knows, and be able to make that dream come true. Nobody knows.
Ambiguity is actually a hallmark of great art.
Yes.
The Mona Lisa smile. What does it mean? Where does that ending take you? It doesn't have to be wrapped up in that neat package. And I think if anything is an indicator that we need to stop, I think that statement definitely is. Watch your step on the way out, everybody. We'll catch you again next time. Be well. Thanks for joining us for another episode from the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss a single episode.